Good afternoon and welcome to Brave Girls Virtual Storytime. Happy Women's History Month. It is the second day of Women's History Month, and it's also the second day of Read Across America Week. My name is Lori Ann, and I'm the Director of Education here at the National Women's History Museum. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this special Brave Girls Virtual Storytime. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended a Brave Girls program before, welcome back. I know some of you follow along weekly or monthly, so thank you for that. We thank you for taking time out of your Wednesday to be with us this afternoon. And as always, we are recording this presentation so that it can be available on our website following the event. This month's Brave Girls Virtual Storytime programming is co-presented with DC Public Library in collaboration with NBCUniversal Telemundo Unstoppable Women, with generous underwriting support from Time Warner Media. We appreciate all of their time and generosity. Today's program kicks off the NWHM's Women's History Month celebrations of the women who inspire us, nurture us, move us forward, and dare us to fulfill our greatest potential, including the hero of today's inspiring biography, Pura Belpré, a storyteller, puppeteer, and New York City's first Puerto Rican librarian, who championed bilingual literature. And remember that a biography is a story of a person's life and will include important information and events from her life. For example, when Pura Belpré came to America in 1921, she carried with her the folklore of her Puerto Rican homeland. Finding a new home at the New York Public Library as a bilingual assistant, she turned her popular retellings into books and spread story seeds across the land. Today, these seeds have grown into a lush landscape as generations of children and storytellers continue to share her tales and celebrate Pura's legacy. Now, I speak more metaphorically here, of course, as does our author, likening stories to seeds and comparing a love of reading to a lush landscape. That's what a metaphor is, after all, a word or phrase used to describe something as if it were something else. Author Anika Denise, joins me today. She will be reading her 2019 picture book, Planting Stories, The Life of Librarian and Storyteller Pura Belpré. My tongue's getting away from me today. Anika will answer your questions after the presentation, so if you, your classmates, or your grown-ups would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function there on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. You may ask your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to as many as time allows. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our author. Anika Aldamuy Denise is an award-winning author of fiction and nonfiction picture books. Her debut picture book biography, Planting Stories, won a Pura Belpré author honor, an NCTE Orbis picture honor, and the Arnold Adolph Poetry Award. Anika's books have been featured in the New York Times, Today.com, Kids Indie Next List, Smithsonian Magazine, Junior Library Guild, and Bank Street College's Best Books of the Year editions. Her latest book, A Girl Named Rosita, the story of Rita Moreno, actor, singer, dancer, trailblazer, received a starred review from School Library Journal and was chosen for the 2022 Texas Topaz Nonfiction Reading List and the Rise Feminist Book Project List. This fall, her third picture book biography, Phenomenal AOC, The Roots and Rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, will be published by HarperCollins. In addition to writing, Anika is an advocate for Latinx Kidlit, mentoring emerging writers for Las Musas Collective. Born and raised in New York, she now lives in Rhode Island with her family. Brave girls and boys, please join us in welcoming Anika to our story time.
Buenas, gracias. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Happy Women's History Month. This is so exciting. I love celebrating the mujeres, right? Oh my goodness. And it's also Read Across America Day. So this is like an extra special kickoff to an incredible celebration of reading, of strong women, of brave girls and boys. And I'm so pleased to be presenting my story about a very brave girl, a brave woman, a trailblazer, Pura Belpré. Now, you all may know Pura Belpré from the award that is named after her for children's literature. It is given every year by the American Library Association to Latino illustrators and authors who represent their culture and their experience in stories. But why was this award named after her? And that is the amazing part of this story, is you're going to learn why this important, dynamic, fantastic storyteller and librarian is still talked about today. And I will tell you just a little bit of background before I read the story about how I got the idea, because that's a question I get a lot. Why did you want to write about her? Well, first, I'm from New York. I was raised in Queens and the Bronx, and I am of Puerto Rican descent, right? So I actually grew up reading these stories. I remember going to the library with my titi Rosie, and she picked out a book off the shelf, and it was this one, Perez and Martina by Pura Belpré. And I was in the library, in the New York Public Library, many years later. I read this as a little girl. And I'm in the library many years later, and they have, it was at the main branch of the library, the one with the two lions out front. You've probably seen pictures of it. Those of you who are watching from New York, you've probably been there, right? It's a beautiful library. There are tons of libraries, which Pura worked in all of them, uptown and downtown, all over New York City. But this library was doing a special exhibit of all authors and children's books. And they had a room dedicated to Pura Belpré. And I walk around the corner and I see this picture of this woman, and her hands are out and she's telling a story to a group of children. And then I see in a glass case this cover of this book with some puppets under glass, very beautiful handmade puppets. And I flash back to being about 6 years old in the library with my auntie, with Titi Rosie, and remembering this book. And looking at the woman who the award is named after, and I thought, my goodness, I remember her stories. They were important to me. They were a part of my childhood. I would love to write a book about her. And that's how it came to be. And that's why I wanted to write about her, because I wanted to know more. The cool thing about true stories is you have to do the research. But as an author, I learned so much. I knew a little bit about Pura Belpré. I didn't know her full story. So I did the research, and I came across a quote in my research. And she said she wished to be like Johnny Appleseed. And Johnny Appleseed, what did Johnny Appleseed do? Planted apple trees throughout the United States, right? So Pura Belpré said she wanted to be like Johnny Appleseed, but instead of planting seeds, she wanted to plant stories. And that's how I got the idea for the book, and even the title, Planting Stories, The Life of Librarian and Storyteller Pura Belpré. So this book is what I'm going to read to you today. It is illustrated by Paula Escobar and published by HarperCollins. So why don't we begin? And we're going to put this up on the screen. Yes, okay, Planting Stories. The Life of Librarian and Storyteller Pura Belpré. Oh, look, it turns the page and everything. That is so cool. It is 1921. Pura Teresa Belpré leaves her home in San Juan for a visit to Nueva York. Words travel with her. Stories her abuela taught her. Cuentos folclóricos Pura retold in the shade of the tamarind tree in Puerto Rico. Now a new island stretches before her, ripe for planting seeds of the cuentos she carries. Manhattan, a city of hustle and bustle, bigger, louder, crowded, yet alive with hope and possibility. What began as a visit to celebrate her sister's wedding becomes the first steps in a new land, y una vida nueva for Pura. So a new land and a new life for Pura. Okay, turn the page. She works first in a garment factory, but it is cold floors and hard edges, not the soft, fertile ground where seeds take root. Then, a golden opportunity, una bendición. The library needs a bilingual assistant. Pura speaks Spanish, English, and French. She's perfect for the job. And you know what I love on this spread is if you follow Pura's eyes out the window, what do you see? It's the public library. But look how the artist has made flowers bloom from it. Okay, we can turn the page. But where are her abuela's stories? Not one folktale from Puerto Rico is on the shelves. How lucky for the library that Pura has story seeds ready to plant and grow. Turn the page. In the children's room, she lights the story hour candle and begins. Her eyes dance, her voice sings. Pura's words paint a picture of a little house with a round balcony where Martina, a beautiful Spanish cockroach, meets Pérez, a handsome and gallant mouse. El ratoncito Pérez y la cucarachita Martina, a tale from the tamarind tree. Next page. When Pura's story is done, each child makes a wish on the candle, and with a wisp of air, whoosh, la vela is blown out. Now, Pura has a wish too, to plant her story seeds throughout the land. Pura learns to make puppets. She snips and sews their clothes, paints their delicate faces. So I'm just going to tell you a little quick thing. I sometimes interrupt the story, but in the New York Public Library, they would light a candle for every story hour, and I believe they still do it. I think it's such a nice tradition. We should have lit a candle before I started reading today. We'll pretend to blow one out when I'm done. And remember what I said about Pura's puppets? So that's her hand making the puppets. And what do you think she's going to do with them? Let's see. Let's turn the page. Families come to hear folk tales in Inglés y Español, to watch Pura's puppets dance across the stage of her stories. So now she's using the puppets to tell her stories. Okay, we can turn the page. But the library needs libros for its shelves. It needs books, right? The stories are in her mind. How can more children read Pérez y Martina and other cuentos de Puerto Rico? Pura puts her story in an envelope. She types it on a typewriter. You probably don't know what a typewriter is. That's how we used to do it before there was computers. She puts her story in an envelope and mails it to Frederick Warren, a publisher. So she actually puts it in the mail, not email, in a mailbox and mails it. Okay, let's turn the page. Soon, Pérez y Martina is a book. Now a published author, puppeteer, and storyteller, Pura travels from branch to branch, classroom to classroom, to churches and community centers, planting her story seeds in the hearts and minds of children new to this island who wish to remember la lengua y los colores of home. So all those new arrivals in New York City who might remember these stories from where they're from, the stories help them. Writing, learning, speaking, teaching, traveling, Pura does not slow down until, like the beautiful Martina, she meets her Perez. You see how the artist guides your eye again? I wanted to show you how wonderful it is that the illustrations help tell the story, because she made that little bridge of pictures connecting Pura to this gentleman who's sitting there. And let's find out who he is. Let's turn the page. On a December day in New York, Pura marries the musician Clarence Cameron White. Un año away from the library, she decides. 1 year to start a new life as a wife. But a year stretches on. Together, they travel to new cities. Clarence plays his music. Pura tells her stories. What a pair they are, huh? And see, she's got the puppets there, and the puppet is making a sound. I don't know if you can see it there, but the sound is, she would have done this while she was telling the stories. Tweet, 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 tweet. After the story is done, I'll tell you more about that, okay? Okay, let's turn the page. They are happy years of music and writing, separations and reunions, friends, family, and stories, always. Until, on a June day in New York, Clarence stops playing his music, and Pura's story must begin again. So that's a bit of a sad part, right? But it's a real story, it's a true story. And in life and in storytelling, there's happy and there's sad. So okay, let's turn the page. Let's see what happens. What do you think she would do now? Okay, where did we begin this story? It was 1921, right? Now it is 1961. Pura returns to the library. There are others now, storytellers who make puppets dance, who read Perez y Martina, The Tiger and the Rabbit, Juan Bobo, The Three Magi, and many more of Pura's stories to the children. Look at that library. It looks different than it did when she first got there. There are more kids, there are more librarians, there are more puppet shows, there are more books. That's important. Okay, let's turn the page. The seeds she has planted, the roots that grew shoots into the open air of possibility, have become a lush landscape into which she steps as though she has never left. And that is el fin, the end. It's not the end of Pura's story, though. And if you read the author's note, there's more about, a little bit about her and where she was born and what she did and how she kept on telling stories even into her 80s. Late 80s, she would still bring her puppets and tell stories, and she was still writing. So let's turn the page one more time, because I think there's a little bit more. In here, this is a little bit about the stories mentioned in this book. And one of the stories that I told you about was the one, you see the connection now from when I was a little girl? Perez y Martina? Yes, that is the first, this is the first Latino storybook that was ever written in the United and published in the United States. That was what Pura did, right? Because she realized that there weren't any of the stories that she knew as a kid on the library shelves. And so she could have said, well, oh well, I'll just read something else. But she didn't. She said, okay, I know the stories, I can tell them, and I can write them down. And she wrote them down and wound up writing many, many more. There are here's whole collections of her stories. This is The Tiger and the Rabbit, which we talked about, and Other Tales, which is in the book. It's illustrated by Tommy DePaula, who you might know some of his other books. She wrote tons and tons of stories that are still in libraries today. Yeah, we can stop sharing the screen. Yeah, she wrote so many stories, and it was because of her being smart and being brave and being creative and using puppets and making storytelling with Spanish and English that we have a lot of today's literature. It's almost like she was the godmother of these stories. And that's why the award is named after her, because of what she started. And can you see why that is a little bit like planting seeds in a garden? Yeah, a garden of stories grew from her being smart, brave, and creative. Okay. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for learning about Pura Belpré. I want to leave enough time for questions, so I will let it go. And if anything you want to ask me, I'm here to answer.
Well, thank you, Anika, for that wonderful story, for the wonderful reading. Guys, just a programming note here that disrupting the chat, it can be very distracting for our audiences. There have been numerous requests to please stop chatting. Unfortunately, I can't turn off the chat. I don't have that kind of functionality. So let's all take our questions for Anika to the Q&A feature and leave the chat alone for now. Thank you for your cooperation. Let's all be respectful to one another. Now, there have been a lot of questions. Someone says, I want to read all these books. I mean,
oh, good.
Sounds like you have inspired some readers.
Well, I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something about this book that's going to make you go, oh, and really want to read it. It has a very interesting ending. Not at all what you would expect. And very different than the folk tales from other places and ones you might be used to. Folk tales from Puerto Rico and other Spanish folk tales and the Caribbean and Latino stories have a different flavor to them. And so I would suggest, if you're curious about this book, to go find it in your library and find out what the ending is. That's all I'm going to say.
Now you have us all curious.
Yes, I know. See, I know how to plant those seeds to go and read more books.
You learned your lessons well. And one of our young audience members did ask, is Pura still alive?
She is not. She passed away in 1982, I believe, at a very, she lived a long and wonderful life. Actually, on the eve of the day she passed, she was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the New York Public Library. And of course, that's an amazing legacy. And then, of course, she has the award named after her. And people still read her stories and do storytelling based on what she did and use puppets based on her characters. I mean, Pura's no longer with us, but she's still alive and well in libraries and books.
Wonderful. Melcy, who I believe is a third grader from New York, she asked, how did she actually find out that she can make puppets?
Oh, so back when you used to be hired by the New York Public Library, they paid for library school. If you were on the track to become, she started as a library assistant, and when she was on the track to become a full librarian, she would then go to library school. It was an amazing, incredible program. And part of what she did there was she took a storytelling and puppetry class. So she learned how not just to, use the puppets, but how to make them. And was then able to incorporate them into her storytelling and also teach puppet classes and using marionettes, the whole thing. And she did those as workshops in the library. I mean, I love puppets. I find it very hard to think about my story and then also do the puppets. It takes real skill. So Pura was a pioneer, not just in storytelling, but in puppetry too. She even designed a mobile puppet theater. No one had thought of that. I mean, maybe in other places, but because she had to travel with her puppets, right? She would go way uptown, to way downtown. She was with the South Bronx Project, and she designed this collapsible mobile puppet theater, which she took with, and people use her design and use her ideas. So she was pretty creative and talented in that way.
There was another question that related to that I was trying to find. Do they still do the puppet shows at the public library?
I believe so. Yeah, and I'm sure if they're doing one thing that Pura Belpré did at all the libraries that she worked at was she would have a big celebration for lots of cultural things and holidays, but she had a big celebration around Three Kings Day, which is a holiday celebrated in Spanish-speaking countries. And so she would read the Three Magi, the story that she wrote, and there would be food, and there would be storytelling, and there would be puppets. And I know that the libraries, still do those celebrations, especially in the branches where she worked, Aguilar and the Schomburg Center, and places where her legacy is very strong, because these are the libraries where she spent the most time, still do puppet shows. And there's even there's a theater that does, what is the name of it? I'm forgetting. Teatro, I can't remember, but it's dedicated to telling her stories. And so they adapt and go in schools in New York. Some of your teachers that are watching, I think I saw in the chat that there was someone watching from the Bronx and watching, they still do almost like reenactments. I think there's even an actress who plays Pura Belpré and does the puppets. And so, yeah, that, like I said, she's still alive and well, and the celebrations are still happening. And it's really beautiful that something that she pioneered has gone on to live and grow, and people add their own spin to it. It's beautiful. In fact, I even did a program in Boston at a library, and I should have brought them here. The librarian made puppets for each one of the kids, and very simply made. They were wooden, almost like wooden spoons, have a little bit of lace that they glued, googly eyes, things you could do at home. And they made a Martina the cockroach and Perez the mouse. The mouse has a little straw hat, a little pava, and really, really fun. So you don't even have to be trained in library school and puppetry. You can use things, and craft your own puppets. So maybe that's something to give a try to teachers.
Good idea.
Puppet making workshop, right?
And Skylar would like to know what made her want to travel to New York to begin with.
This is so interesting, because I was just talking with another writer about this and about writing. They call what picture book biographies narrative nonfiction. And that just means it's true, but it's written like a story that is fiction. It's narrative. It has a story arc. It has characters. It has events and tension and all that stuff that would be in any story, but it's a true story. And one of the things that is unclear when I did my research, so she came for her sister's wedding. That was in the research. Her sister, Elisa, and I've spoken to her grandnieces. I've spoken to Elisa's grandnieces, was getting married, had moved to New York already. Pura Belpré was enrolled in the University of PR, actually become a teacher. She comes for her sister's wedding, and she winds up staying. But never did she ever write down why. It's not in any of her talks. It's not in any of the films, little film clips we have of her. When I asked her grandnieces, they said, we don't know. It's just not something she talked about. So I know she came for a wedding. I don't know why she stayed. I can maybe imagine why she would stay. And that's why it's not specifically put in the book, because I couldn't verify it as a fact of why. And in the author's note, I say that we don't know why, but probably it was because New York excited her. New York at the time, and where she was living in Harlem, in East Harlem, there was an incredible wave of Spanish-speaking new arrivals coming from all different places. There was a big migration from Puerto Rico, where she came from. And she wanted to, she probably found her community there. And then got an opportunity unexpectedly to be a library assistant. And clearly, I feel like it was fate. Like, here's a woman with all this storytelling talent. And I think the job was offered to her sister first. And her sister turned it down, recommended Pura, interview for the job, and she got it. And I feel like, imagine if that didn't happen. Think about that for a second. All the stuff that she started, that she did, that was so incredible. Imagine if she decided to take the boat back or the plane back, right? Or her sister took the job instead of her. All these things, I feel like she was in exactly the place that she should have been and exactly the right person to do what she did. And that we're all grateful that Pura Belpré was hired by the 135th Street branch and wound up having a long career. Interesting, though, that she left the library for a long time. 20 years she left, I think about that as a person who has a family and works as a writer. And it's just amazing to me that she stepped out of the library. She kept writing and she used her time, storytelling and being with her husband who traveled and then was able to step back into it and then go on to do more and more incredible things. So she's truly a remarkable woman. She's had a unique path that doesn't follow what you would typically think of. But I kind of love that about her, and that inspires me. And of course, I love about her is that what she understood long before, it's something we know now, is that, it's important to be able to see a lot of communities in books, right? But she knew that 100 years ago. She got that, so wow, what a visionary.
Well, on that note, I'm going to take just one last question because we're at time. But and forgive me if I do not pronounce its name correctly, but I believe it's Isatu. Ask the question: what made you want to start writing stories?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I was a writer, but I was a writer. I worked for like an advertising agency, so I did writing, like copywriting. I have daughters. My very first daughter was born, Sophia, and Sophia was a little kid who liked books. Like even when she was a baby, those board books, she'd hold them, and we were reading all the time, And my husband is a children's book illustrator. That for some trivia. So he had been illustrating books. So here I was immersed in, I could see how they were made. And I could see how they were used when she was snuggled up on my lap and reading so much that I thought, I would really like to try writing a story. So I did, and I did what Pura did. I hand wrote my stories, and I typed it on a computer, not a typewriter. And I sent them into publishers. Same. I gave it a try. And then once I started doing it, I loved it so much. And then once I started doing that, I wanted to write stories about people that looked and sounded like my own family and highlight people from Puerto Rico, where my family is from. So,
well, we're glad you did.
Thank you.
All right, just some closing notes here. I want to thank Anika again for sharing this inspiring story with us. Just a reminder again that today the presentation was recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel, actually viewing later this week. Thank you again to our generous sponsor, Time Warner Media, our collaborator, NBCUniversal Telemundo, and Unstoppable Women, a phenomenal program if you haven't heard about it. And our co-presenter for this month's programming is the DC Public Library. Please join us for the next Brave Girls Virtual Storytime during our continuing Women's History Month celebration. That'll be on Wednesday, March 16th with Bad Hair Does Not Exist. Great story, great author. And until then, keep reading and be brave. Thank you, Anika. Thank you to all our audiences. Have a wonderful Women's History Month.
You too.